We're doing something a little different again today. I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Peter Boghossian, who's a full-time faculty member in Portland State University's philosophy department, as well as author of the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, on our full program today. Our regular sort of daily political stories are going to be on today's bonus show. So yet more incentive to become a subscriber to the David Pakman Show. Peter, it's always great to talk to you. I want to start first digging into the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, in a little more detail. And as you know, I'm going to be using portions of that book in an upcoming course I'll be teaching as an adjunct professor at Boston College. So certainly I think that there's huge value to this book, but there's some ideas in it I'd love to dig into a little more with you. And to start, maybe you could familiarize the audience with how you define faith in the book for the purposes of exploring it further.
Okay, if it's okay, I'd like to take a step back from that and talk about what the purpose of the book is.
Sure.
The purpose of the book is there's one big word in the whole book, and that's epistemology, and that basically means how you know what you know. The purpose of the book is to help people become more reflective, to examine their epistemologies, to examine the way they know things, and it's to help people engage in civil conversations. And there are now literally hundreds of, more than hundreds, thousands of these online and YouTube, in which people take the techniques from the book as a template and personalize that, have conversations with other people about their metaphysical beliefs, faith-based, basically any beliefs. So that being said, faith has many, many definitions. John Loftus describes as the leap over probabilities, as pretending to know something you don't know, as insufficient evidence to warrant belief in a claim, but yet you decide to believe anyway. There are many, many definitions of faith. Hebrews 1:11 has a definition in the Bible of faith. The Quran faith is not explicitly defined. Evidence of things unseen is the and coupled with hope. So there are many, many definitions, and among the most important thing in these conversations is that we clarify what we mean by our terms right from the get-go.
So how do you define faith? What are the two ways you define faith in the book?
I define faith as, I think I define faith in 3 or 4 ways, but pretending to know things you do not know. Faith is also believing anyway. I know you asked me for 2, but it's hard to pin it down to 2. Believing anyway, when you're going to believe something just because you want to believe it, basically because your moral mind overrides your rational mind.
Well, belief without evidence was the other one I was thinking of, in addition to pretending to know things you don't know.
Yeah, belief without sufficient evidence. Sufficient is the key word there, because you can have evidence for a lot of things, but that's not sufficient to warrant a confidence in a belief.
I've been thinking about the word pretending in that first definition you gave, pretending to know things you don't know. I don't know that that's that common. I mean, a lot of people are probably not pretending. They more than likely, based on the conversations I've had with people, they believe things that you and I might say you can't actually know that based on the available evidence. So talk about your decision to include the word pretending to know things you don't know.
Well, if that was the case, why would they have crises of faith? Why does everybody say they have crisis? You don't have a crisis that a pencil sharpener exists, right?
No, I think that's fair, but that still doesn't mean at some point one might have a realization. All this time, I've believed to know things that were not supported by evidence, but it's still very difficult to say that at any point someone is pretending to know something they don't know. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing it out there.
Yeah, no. It's a totally legitimate, reasonable question. I had you know, Ryan Bell is the guy who tried to live without God for a year and then became an atheist.
No.
Well, he's an interesting guy. He has a movie that's coming out about that journey that took for him. He just tried to live a year without God. He was a pastor in LA he had a formidable flock, to use that word. And then he decided to try to live a year without God. And I had a conversation with him. He has a movie coming out directed by Emery, be out any time now, about his journey. And he pressed me on that. And I would urge people to watch that conversation, because at the end of the conversation, he said, yeah, you know what, I really didn't know. And I had gaps in my understanding of things, and I made those gaps up I mean, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. I made those gaps up by pretending.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying everybody is pretending. I think that there are certainly some people who are suffering from legitimate religious delusions about talking snakes and what have you. These people aren't pretending. They're actually delusional. But many people, I can't give you a percentage, but many people pretend to know something. And I gave a talk on this at the Greater Humanists of Portland. It's online. I think it's called Faith, Pretending to Know Things You Don't Know,
Hmm.
where I lay out and explain the differences. That's why people, by the way, make that leap between mixing up the definition of faith with hope and trust. And they do that because you don't have to pretend anything when you hope for something. I can hope for anything I want. Sam Harris says I can hope for a diamond the size of a refrigerator in my backyard, but I don't need to pretend that. When you have faith in something, you have confidence that extends beyond the warrant of evidence. And to make up for that confidence, you need something. Usually that something is faith. And usually people, that little gap, that little space in there between the evidence you have and the confidence you have in that belief has to be made up somehow.
I think that's interesting because, like, from my perspective, I mean, as you know, and most of my audience knows, I'm basically on board with what it is we're talking about here and your point of view. But I do think that there are sometimes more gray areas than I like to admit when it comes to faith and evidence. And just to sort of put this idea out there,
Sure.
in some sense, couldn't we say any inductive reasoning requires some of what we might colloquially describe as faith? And I'll give an example, right? So
Sure.
if I were to make an assertion like, I have faith that Jesus Christ is God, or whatever, right? That's pretty clear to you and to me as, yeah, a basic epistemological intervention of the types you sort of walk people through in your book can get many people to reconsider that particular faith statement. But in the same way, we might believe gravity is uniform across our universe. We don't really have what I would even call substantial evidence for that. We've studied or observed like a tiny fraction of the universe. We're using inductive reasoning. And if we really look at sort of the philosophical definition of knowledge, a justified true belief, that might be a faith type belief that gravity functions the same way across our universe, wouldn't it?
Wow, we really need to unpack that. That's a lot there. Sean Carroll, the physicist Sean Carroll, calls issue with that idea that there's a, and Victor Stenger also wrote some stuff about that there's a uniformity of gravity. Look, first of all, I'm not a physicist, so I can't really
Sure,
speak
but
on
conceptually, I think it applies.
Right. But we wouldn't say that we had faith. We would say we have a suspicion. Our confidence that we could extrapolate from this corner of the universe and the physical phenomena, gravitational waves, et cetera, found in this corner of the universe, that we can extrapolate from that and say that there's a universality of that. Here's the difference, and this was a big light bulb moment for me.
Yeah.
People usually use this to say, well, you have faith, your wife loves you. All right, so I'm just going to back away just for a moment, and I'll get back to the induction for sure.
Yep.
The issue with that is that your wife is a real person who lives with you. We don't have any, I mean, there's even people, a lot of people, David Fitzgerald, Bob Price, etc., who cast doubt on the historicity of Jesus. Now, I want to say one more thing. That's not how religious people use the word faith. And let me give you
let me just attempt, because I think we might be deviating from maybe the point I was going to. I understand that religious people might define faith differently, but I guess what I'm saying is the way you and I would define faith, I feel like, as someone who, again, is mostly on board with your assertions about this issue, that the line between what we know and what requires faith is maybe not as clear as you sometimes make it out to be. And I think your replacement of, or your use of the word suspicion is, now that's a new word. Where along the spectrum does suspicion fall between faith and knowledge?
Hold on, before we hold on, we got to back up, because these are huge things that we have to unpack.
Okay.
We don't say that we have faith that the laws of gravity apply in Alpha Centauri or some other
correct
more remote. We don't say that.
Right.
We say that based on the best available evidence, we assign a confidence value to that belief. You don't
Mm-hmm.
even need suspicion. We can take the words suspicion is too laden anyway. But we assign a confidence value to that belief. How confident are we in that belief is directly proportional to the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to extend the confidence, the warrant of belief beyond the confidence of the evidence. We don't do that in anything else. We don't do that with, how fast Jaguars run. So why would we do that when it comes to claims for which we have even less evidence? It makes no sense whatsoever unless you look at these things as moral claims as opposed to empirical claims. So look, the problem of induction about, we extrapolate from the past. Bertrand Russell has some great stuff about this. We extrapolate from the past to the future and assume that in the future is going to resemble the way what happened in the past, and we do that because we've lived in the past, and we then extrapolate from that. But you don't need any faith whatsoever from that. Look, if tomorrow radishes started, sprouting into, or I bit into an apple and it tasted like a roast beef sandwich, that's Bertrand Russell's example, that we wouldn't need any faith whatsoever for that. Faith is specifically a word that people use when they do not have sufficient evidence to believe something, but they believe it anyway. That is how people actually use the term, and you don't find physicists using that term in regard to phenomena that happen in remote corners of the universe.
Let's pause our conversation there with Dr. Peter Boghossian. We will be back after the break with plenty more. We're continuing our conversation today for the entire hour with Dr. Peter Boghossian. I want to talk a little bit, Peter, about an issue that you've been speaking about a lot over the last couple of years, and this relates to concerns about some of what's going on in academia in the United States. So I want to start with a tweet from April of 2016 that you sent, where you talked about gender studies. And you said gender studies is primarily composed of radical ideologues who view indoctrination as their primary duty. These departments must be defunded.
I completely stand by that.
Good. So I want to break down some aspects of that. First is sort of there's an assertion you make about radical ideologues. How do we define what is a radical ideologue? And then how do you quantify whether they believe that their primary duty is indoctrination? In other words, how did you source that tweet or come up with that idea?
Okay, so we got to take those one at a time. So give me your first question. You like to pack a lot of stuff.
I pack it in, and let you answer. So how do you define whether a college professor, particularly one in gender studies, is a radical ideologue? How do you figure that out?
Well, not just gender studies, but anything infected by postmodernism, and gender studies happens to be the most egregious example of that.
Okay.
You figure it out because you look at their self. That's an awesome question, by the way. I really hope that if people get nothing out of that, they just listen to that question and then listen to this response.
Okay.
We know this because when we look at and I'm happy to email you some stuff about this, when we look at the course descriptions, these are not merely information-based courses. These are ideology mills. They want people to adopt specific views about the world, about homosexuality, which basically I have as well, by the way. But these are ideology mills in which the goal is not to educate, from the Latin educare, to lead out of like if you think about it in terms of Plato's cave, you're coming from a place of darkness to a place of light. You are putting beliefs into people. And we know that because not only do we look at the course descriptions of gender studies, any gender studies program you want, and I mean literally any and every, but we can also look at the mission statement of peer-reviewed journals. So
okay, but hold on. Let's not. I want to focus because of the tweet. The tweet was about defunding gender studies departments based on radical ideology.
Yeah, what do we do about that? Well, look, we can do what I tried to do, which is publish a hoax paper, or it was a satire on gender studies to show that the emperor has no clothes. We can make this fact available to parents who are paying tuition for their students to become indoctrinated into these insane ideas.
Okay, but hold on, Peter. I think let me slow us down. Usually you're slowing me down. Let me slow down a little bit. So in figuring out whether a professor is a radical ideologue, you said you look at whether the syllabus includes ideology rather than teaching? Or how do you determine that? Like, what would be an example of a syllabus that would indicate we're dealing with a radical ideologue?
Not a syllabus. This is way beyond a syllabus.
Okay.
This is the whole department's mission statement.
Okay.
This is their mission statement, and I would look it up right now, but we're live on camera. But this is what this isn't me. I want to be crystal clear about that. This is not me saying this. This is them saying this. This is in their own words what they want to do. They are activists. Look how many times the word activism appears in their course descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
These people self-describe as activists.
And
So
on what
it-
basis?
it's way
On what
beyond
basis should an academic department be funded or not?
Well, based upon whether or not their conclusions accord with reality.
As
Yeah,
determined
also
by
think
whom?
I also think we should defund theology departments as well. Well, look, okay, so there is a broad spectrum of this. At one end, you have theoretical physicists who are positing ideas about the nature of the universe, unified field theory, string theory, all this stuff that I don't understand.
Okay.
And the argument has been made that there's not enough evidence for that. Okay, great. But these people aren't claiming to know this. These are not, here's the difference. Daniel Dennett said it best. Philosophy, the discipline that I'm in, when you work in philosophy, you should be doing work of abiding significance. Those are Dennett's terms that he uses in a little paper called CHMESS, C-H-M-E-S-S, chess with the mess in it. The difference between somebody wasting their time working on issues of non-abiding significance is it really doesn't, the papers inside it really doesn't make any difference. I think I heard a lecture in which 80% of papers in humanities are only cited one time, if at all, 0 to 1 times. Gender studies and disciplines infected by postmodernism are different in that they're morally motivated. So it's not just that they twiddle their thumbs and work away on esoteric problems, how many grains of sand in a heap and things like this, but they work to radicalize and galvanize people into moral ways of viewing the world. And I would argue that if you look at the madness emanating from colleges today, it can be directly traced back to postmodernism in general and gender studies in specific.
But Peter, I guess my question, is
one more thing. They are solely responsible for intersectionality, the worst plague that's affecting us right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about the ways in which that's problematic. But I guess if we imagine this spectrum that you've talked about, which is theoretical physics on one side, and let's imagine gender studies at the other, who decides where the line is drawn between what is legitimate for academic departments to teach and study and what isn't?
Okay, if you were to go back 50 years, that question would be easy. You'd say, does this stuff pass peer review? Does it muster are there lines of literature on this? But we can't do that anymore. It's almost like phrenology. Like if there were a discipline, when they look the shape of the head and such, and they extrapolate and make inferences about one's intelligence and race and such.
Right.
It's been debunked. So if we look at what's happening now in gender studies, these people are making their own journals. Admittedly, this isn't just gender studies, but in gender studies, you find the worst examples.
Yeah, we can focus on that since it's a good one for us to discuss.
Yeah, so you find people making their own journals, publishing in their own journals, becoming promoted and receiving tenure because they've promoted in their own journals. But
do physicists do the same thing? I mean, physicists have, I feel like we're in a Seinfeld episode, dentists have their own schools. Physicists have their own journals, and those journals and publication in those journals is also used, right? I guess what I'm trying to drill down at is how can we objectively distinguish?
Okay, well, look, but the difference in physics is we can make assessments about physical phenomena of the world, and those are empirical questions. Gender studies is dealing with moral issues, and they're making moral pronouncements of issues, and they're backing this up by their own invented corpus of literature. And again, I'm on board with most of these conclusions about egalitarian treatment of people, transgender people, like I'm on board with that. But that is not the role of an academician. That is certainly not the role of an academic department. That makes a mockery of our institutions because it turns the peer review process into a sham. And the way that it does that, and then I'll get back to your issue of defunding, the way that it does that is they're morally motivated, they manufacture their own lines of discipline, they get promoted in tenure, and when you attempt to call them out on this gets back to the earlier segment we did about faith. They believe anyway, right? They're going to believe anyway. Here's an example. Do we want to defund? I don't know. Give me an example of the discipline. Do we want to defund engineering?
Well,
no.
okay, yeah,
why?
Right.
Yeah, well, because there are actual bridges. You go in and you learn a skill about the world. It is an empirical skill.
Okay, that's a perfect spot. I mean, here's really what I'm wondering if we can sort of talk this through together and see if we end up at the same place. Are you in agreement that gender is important to Homo sapiens? In other words, when we think about Homo sapiens and the culture that Homo sapiens live in, is gender relevant?
I would think, of course, it is. Yeah,
you would think it is. Okay. Generally, is there academic value to studying issues of importance to Homo sapiens?
Yeah, and I know where you're going with this.
Well, where I'm going is, it sounds like you disagree with a lot of what is the way in which gender studies is being taught. Maybe the people that are teaching it, the way in which you believe maybe there's this closed loop of sort of credentialing of gender studies through internal peer review, their own journal, so to speak. But it's hard for me to make the case based on what you just said, which is gender is a very relevant element of human society, and that it's important to academically study issues of importance to human society. Based on that alone, it's hard for me to argue there should not be gender studies departments.
Okay, so some of the best research on gender does not come from gender studies departments. They come from sociology departments. If you want a rough guide to figure out whether or not a discipline is legitimate, ask yourself, and by legitimate I mean correlates its facts to external reality. Ask yourself if the methodologies they use, their epistemologies, if you will, are manufactured or they're not. So, for example, bridge building, to get back to engineering, and most disciplines out of the humanities, the hard sciences, we use the scientific method. If you want to justify a moral conclusion that you make, but you can't do it, you can't reason your way to it, one thing that we see now in postmodernism, disciplines infected by postmodernism, is that they make up their own methodologies to justify their conclusions. For example, autoethnography is and I would urge your viewers to Google and look up autoethnography because it's just so crazy. Autoethnography is the idea that you basically do self-interviews and relate them to the literature in some way. It's your own, and the body of literature on autoethnography and the individual papers coming out about autoethnography will absolutely blow your mind.
Okay, that's fair, but just to keep us laser focused, if we can, it sounds like we're in a blurry area in the sense that you don't like gender studies as taught by gender studies departments, but you're conceding that gender studies is important to human society.
Gender is important. Gender is important, and then I will tell you something that I find fascinating, if you don't mind. Gender is important. I think there's overwhelming evidence that these. Let me say something. I cannot tell you why this is, but I find this to be absolutely fascinating. My wife is an anthropologist, and she has an MD. That's somewhat beside the point. But when she was getting her MD PhD, she met many people working in cross-cultural women's issues. And I like the work of these people. I'm not going to tell you their names specifically. So I said to my wife, I would like to use this person, these people, as an example of somebody who's doing really good work on gender. In this particular example, and I'll tell you why I'm not going to give you specifics in a moment, this woman worked at the intersection of public health policy and transgender issues and AIDS. It's also some really good stuff about travestis in Brazil, etc. So my wife said, well, why don't you call her up and make sure it's okay that you use her name? And I said, well, absolutely. If someone wanted to use my name and my work, I do, absolutely. So I called her up, said who I was. She said, oh, yeah, and I said, I'd like you to use your name. And she said, no. And I said, really? And she said, no, I'm just not comfortable with that. I said, okay, can you give me the example? Can you please give me 3 or 4 examples of people you consider to be doing good work in gender studies or with gender in particular? And she said, no. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then I just kind of wrote it off as an anomaly. I have subsequently asked 2 additional people I respect, people whose work I respect, if I could, maybe I'm a too controversial a figure, I don't know, or if they could recommend somebody else, a version of which is called snowball sampling. Uh, can you recommend somebody else's work that I can read or that I can look at? And both of those people said no. So there's that's very interesting to me. And maybe academicians don't want to go public, but I think that there's something in the nature of this field that is absolutely toxic at its core. So much so that people really don't want their work subject to any scrutiny because at base, I think they're pretending. I think that they are morally motivated ideologues and they realize at its core that the work coming out of their departments is not based in reality. These are activists who are masquerading as academicians.
All right. Well, your point of view on that coming through loud and clear. Let's pause there with Dr. Peter Boghossian, more after the break. Let's continue our conversation with Dr. Peter Boghossian. Peter, an issue that I'm very interested in, because I think that it is very often portrayed inaccurately on the political spectrum by both sides, is that issue of what is often called white privilege. Now, you've written about white privilege. For our conversation, I want to restrict our conversation to the United States specifically, and I think it'll sort of become relevant why as we go on. Do you believe that in the United States in 2017, there is any degree of what is colloquially referred to as white privilege?
Yeah, can I ask what you mean by that? Because we may mean different things by that.
I guess by white privilege, I mean an unearned deference that one has by virtue of being or being perceived as, and the perceived as will be relevant to our conversation, in a majority white country by virtue of being perceived as white.
Do I think that confers social or confers advantages on people?
Sure.
Yeah, I do.
So talk a little bit about where you see white privilege as a real thing and where you think that some assertions about white privilege sort of go off the rails.
Oh, this is a huge conversation. 15. How long do we have for this segment?
Well, let's try it. I mean, I think let's consider it an overview conversation, something we might dig into in more detail at some future point.
So is it more or less, so this is an empirical question to which I do not have the data. It's outside my area of expertise, but this is a way that one would think about the problem. Is it more or less likely that somebody who's black or perceived as black would be pulled over by the police for a minor infraction in a vehicle than somebody who's white or perceived as white? My hunch would be to say yes, although I watched the Larry Elder and Dave Rubin video that really made me think that my belief in this could be might not be as evidence-based as it is. And I have to say, I don't have the evidence, but I do have what I think are good ways to think about the problem.
Yeah.
So, and then what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences for the criminal justice system? I mean, we know by and large that the criminal justice system is geared toward money. So if you're wealthy, you have more opportunities to get off, even if you're guilty, frankly, than if you're not. And we know that that poverty is, I wouldn't say endemic in the black community, but I would certainly say statistically there are larger numbers of African Americans living in poverty than there are percentages of whites. So I do think that white privilege is something that's real. It may correspond to economics. It may also correspond to the fact that black on black crimes are perceived as. So again, that the whole issue is just so charged that we have really created a. I notice that I'm being far more judicious in my words because I know that any misstatement or anything that I can say will be perceived as something else. I don't think we're ready to have an honest conversation about this. I think we're very
Interesting.
far from it.
I mean, just to
But
give you like an anecdote, I feel like I have white privilege despite being unclear as to whether I'm white. And what I mean by that is I'm a Hispanic immigrant to the United States,
oh, we're
whose ethnicity, I'm from Argentina. My ethnicity is Ashkenazi Jewish, right?
okay.
And I am sort of, and I use the term lucky, maybe it's not the exact right term, but I have benefited from the reality that I moved to the US when I was 5 instead of 10, and thus lost my accent when speaking English. And
Yeah.
because my ancestry ethnically is European Ashkenazi Jewish, I also am perceived as white. Now, social class being the same, education
You're
being the same,
excuse me, you're visually perceived as white.
visually perceived as white, yeah. So holding my social class level and sort of my education level the same as it is, I am
Yeah.
very aware that when I have an interaction with police, my ability to say what I think is concerning about their behavior, if I see them harassing someone on the street or when they show up at a loud wedding party that I'm at, like I was at last week, if I
Yeah.
had darker skin and had learned English 5 years later and thus had an accent, my intelligence would be the same, my social class, holding everything else equal, my relationship with the police might be different. My comfort level in being
Yeah, I
sarcastic
think
or indifferent would be
I
different. So I think that this is sort of an interesting
right.
idea that I've lived myself.
Yeah, I think everything you said, while I don't have any evidence for it, I don't have faith in it. I think it's probably true. I
Hmm.
think it's probably true. If I may interject something else, this is kind of a secret I don't want anybody to know, but it's a good reveal on your show. If you think having white privilege is something, wait until you get to be my age. Then you actually see it.
Hmm.
I mean, gray hair, older guy privilege is awesome.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I mean, everybody treats it seems like just yesterday I'd walk into a store when I was a teenager and people think I'm going to steal stuff. And a little while ago I was in a store and someone said, "Oh, sir, I need to leave. Can you watch the store for me?" I'm like, what? Uh, but yeah, even when you go somewhere, like I go and I don't have my ID on me and I need to go to a bar, a few drinks, and I just point to my head and people go, "Oh, okay." Um, but I have definitely felt older age. I don't think I'm old age yet, but I've definitely felt middle age privilege among the police. Everybody calls me sir. So I think that there are definitely, you can extrapolate outward from that. And you can listen to the sincere testimony or when people say, look, I don't feel comfortable. And it's not just the police. I think it's a general attitude. I think the police have an extremely difficult job, and they're caught between some bad laws, like some drug laws, and enforcing those laws. And they're caught between the fact. This is when the conversation gets very tricky, but and not tricky in terms of facts, but just tricky in terms of the political implications that one draws from those facts. I think that if you look at the majority of, you just need to look at the majority of crimes, specifically violent crimes and murders, and I think that, and again, I don't have access to these data, and I'm happy to change my mind, but it is my impression that a black man is far more likely to be killed by another black man than a white man is to be killed by a black man.
Well, that
And I think,
that's true, but where that often goes off the rails is that if you are white, you're basically just as likely to be the victim of another white person aggrieving you than
yeah,
if
but
you are black. And it's basically it's
that's just
intraracial
because there are
violence
more
is what's
whites.
happening.
That's just because there are more whites. That's just a statistical thing.
Well, there's more whites who could be victims and more whites who could be perpetrators in the same way, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's proportional.
Well, if you look at the number of homicides, and again, I'm getting out of my area now, so
Yeah.
I'm a little uncomfortable about speaking about this stuff. But if you look at the number of homicides, and here's how we know that of black people who have been killed by other black people, and then we match those to the incarceration rates of black people, and you say, well, how do you know it wasn't someone else? Because we get that from the eyewitness testimony of people who perceive other people's races a certain way. You can say, well, that testimony is biased. Okay, maybe it is. I don't really know. I'm not an expert in witness testimony. But I think it's very difficult for the police because they're trying to do the job. And I think we have to ascribe, excuse me, good motivations to the overwhelming majority of police officers. They're trying to do an incredibly difficult job and save people's lives. And they're confronted by some pretty ghastly statistics that accord with their own personal experiences. And look, this is what I think we should do. You want to know? Here's what I think we should do.
Yeah.
And here's why I think what I think we should do will absolutely never in a million years happen. And this will tell you how toxic our current environment is. We need to have experts on, and I am not one of these people by any stretch of the imagination. We need to have experts on policing and the rules of policing and public policy and when force is used and we need to have those people have a discussion, maybe even a debate if you want, with activists in the community. Black Lives Matter, I wouldn't say so, and we need to have that conversation at a university, and we need to have a civil conversation, and we need to really seek for what Jürgen Habermas calls mutual understanding. Could you fathom that happening?
It'd be practically speaking pretty difficult. Yeah, I mean, it would be tough. It would be tough.
No, it would not even be. It would not. It would be. You could never have that conversation. So
I think I could do it. I think I could moderate that and have some degree of success if we had the right people in the room.
I would love for you to. You do this. I'll fly out to BC. You're teaching at BC. You say, look, I would love to see the administrator's face when you tell them this. I think that we should have that I would like to moderate a conversation between people. Now, get actual policemen, not people who are professors who theorize about the police. Get people who are actually involved in these decisions and it can explain to people, and then get people on the other side of the room, try to bring them together, have a civil conversation. I don't think any administrator will approve it because I don't think we're ready to have those conversations. I think that people are afraid that violence will erupt, and I think there's a good reason people are afraid that violence will erupt. But that's the kind of conversation we need. We need to have we need to seek mutual understanding between members of the community and members of the police. For example, why should you, when the police, and even I do this with my gray hair privilege, when the police pull you over, why should you keep your hands on the steering wheel? Well, you should keep your hands on the steering wheel because there have been many instances, and I've seen these videos myself, where people then pull guns out and shoot the cops. So we need to look at this issue from both sides, and I don't think it's simply as easy as systemic racism. I think that the police have an incredibly difficult job to do. But to get back to your earlier point, I do think there's white privilege. I do think that there's value and meaning in talking about that. And I do think that if we're honest about that and we can communicate about that, then we can go. Healing is a goofy word, but it really is the word that applies. We can try to heal these deep divisions. One more thing, we can do that by appealing to what's called in the literature super identity. So super identities, we're all Americans. Remember right after 9/11, for the first time, everybody was super civil and you wanted to get into traffic, people let you go. That lasted about 10 days, maybe 2 weeks tops. But we can appeal to commonalities that we have so that we can solve these problems. That's why the most important thing that we can do is to have a conversation. And David, you really would be among the most perfect people to attempt to broker that conversation. Wow. If you could do that, you would really have something extraordinary on your hands.
Well, I can't think of a better place to take our last break than that. We will wrap up with Dr. Peter Boghossian next. We've been speaking today with Dr. Peter Boghossian, full-time faculty member in Portland State University's Philosophy Department, also author of the book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. Peter, when you take a sort of broader look as to what's going on in American politics, everybody has their sort of general assessment. What put Trump in the White House? What does this mean for the future of one political party or the other political party? Stepping back from the sort of day-to-day politics and firings and scandals and whatever the case may be, do you agree with me that we are increasingly separating the political world from any sense of epistemology, critical thinking, the importance of the facts as we can know them over the last, 6 months, 5 years, 10 years? Like, are you on board with me in that departure that we're seeing?
Univocal. We speak as one voice, absolutely unshakably convinced of that.
What do you attribute that to? Because there are partisan people who say, hey, listen, The Democrats are the party of facts and the Republicans aren't. So you've got a party that, in order to get elected, is going to move away from facts. There's another slightly more general view, which is we have growing pseudo and anti-intellectualism, and that's what is reinforcing sort of pride in not dealing with the facts. I don't know. I mean, what do you think we can point to?
I don't know. The rise of social media, anonymous accounts, the fact that I don't honestly, I don't know. I could only hypothesize the answer to that. I don't know. I do find the deep divides and the inability to have conversation with people and ending of friendships over that. In fact, that's what my next book is about: how to have conversations across a divide, impossible conversations. I think we need to uh, take a look and work collaboratively with people. But in this current political environment, it's almost impossible. I think Trump is I don't even know the adjectives I can describe for how unhinged he is. I used to think that Pence was worse. I'm reevaluating that belief.
Hmm.
But I do think that we need to re-inject the ability to have conversations into the discourse. I don't know what's causing this intense polarization. I just can't answer that question.
I mean, the problem I have is that everything you're saying is true, but sometimes what you're saying is used to point to both sides are just as valid on every issue. Every opinion on every issue has to be heard. And as you know, when you talk about good epistemologies and bad epistemologies in your book, that's not the case. And that's where I think that the general discussions about polarization often lead us nowhere, because they reinforce a need for false balance on every issue.
No, that's a great question. That's a great issue. Now, first of all, everybody has a microphone, so everybody's voice is equal. As James Lindsay said to me, the most important thing for us to do in this age is to determine whose voice doesn't matter. Whose voice doesn't matter. So everybody has a microphone. The Democrats have been held hostage to identity politics, which is one of the worst things. They have a complete failure to acknowledge that many of their tactics and beliefs, particularly as it regards to identity politics and intersectionality, have been directly responsible for the rise of Trump. I don't think it's the case that I think we tend to paint with these broad brushes. I think that the Republicans do tend to be more anti-science, and particularly in regard to environmental issues. And the problem with that is that those might be with us for a very, very, very long time. And there's something about what Trump is doing environmentally now. If you were to put everything he's doing in a basket of crazy versus the environmental stuff, decreasing our standing in the world, you name it, he's got that in spades in terms of anything that's negative. The environmental stuff, I think, would overweigh all of that. And unless we can figure out how to talk to ourselves or talk with each other, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. I don't think the smearing, the name calling, I don't think any of that stuff is productive in helping us solve any. I can't think of any problem in which screeching at someone is either going to make them more likely to change their mind or to solve the problem. In fact, even I'm going to go beyond that. We do not even have the ability, we are not even honest in our conversations anymore, because we're afraid if we make one misstep or if we say one wrong thing, we're going to be branded as a racist or a bigot or as a homophobe. I think these are terrible problems in which, I mean, look what's happening to Sam Harris. You can't even have conversations with people, or Dave Rubin. You can't even ask certain questions. And if you do, either people, if you veer from the orthodoxy, then the people on your own tribe will attack you. Or if you say something that other people find unpalatable, they'll just smear you and put you in
Is that, and I asked Dave Rubin this last week, is that as big of a problem as some are making it out to be? Like, just as an example, like, for example, I share your concerns with radical elements of third wave feminism, intersectionality, sort of these unproductive versions of identity politics, the safe space trigger warning stuff. And as I put it to Dave Rubin, I'll put it to you. Can we agree on the problem, but also come to some better understanding of the degree to which it exists? Because I think that that's where I differ more with folks like you and Dave Rubin, not as to whether these issues are problematic, but the degree to which they exist.
And I'm not sure I understand.
In other words,
Like,
how big, I guess, let me rephrase it this way. I agree with you that every issue you cited as a problem is a problem. However, I'd like to hear more about how you determine the degree to which it's a problem and how prevalent it is. Because I think that, for
yeah,
example, among the left, some of these issues, they're problems, but they're relatively isolated issues.
well, there are problems because one, you have a bunch of extraordinarily vocal people who make it look like they're in the majority, but are probably still in the minority. And
Correct.
unfortunately, right. Let me give you a great example. So I've been on sabbatical for a year. I teach ethics. And if you really want to teach ethics, I mean, if you truly want to get people to challenge their moral views and question things, think about their beliefs, you have to talk about hard issues. You have to talk about transgender bathrooms. You have to talk about factory farming. You have to talk about Peter Singer's, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer's, what should we do with people who have IQs under 25? No one's willing to talk about this stuff. And they're not willing to talk about this stuff because they don't want to deal with the complaints because students are so brittle that they've never heard the other side of the issue.
Hmm.
So I think it depends where you are and what kind of conversations you're having. I think it also depends upon the people with whom you're speaking.
Is there some way that this could be dealt with at an earlier point? And the reason I'm asking that question is specifically when we see, for example, what's going on with Texas textbooks and the total
Yeah.
elimination of critical thinking as a course that is even available hypothetically in high schools. Wouldn't we attack the college issue more successfully if there was critical thinking being taught in high school? And why is it that it's overwhelmingly Republicans that don't want it taught in high school?
Well, one, it's because they're pretending to know something they don't know. Like if you thought you had the truth, you wouldn't proselytize to anybody. They'd come, you could rationally derive those principles on your own. If you honestly believe, for example, in Christianity or whatever superstition you happen to believe in, you wouldn't need to do that. So there is definitely a component of Republicans. The Republican Party has more or less been hijacked by, and you can perfectly see this in the way that plays out with who Trump panders to. That audience has been hijacked by religious maniacs, and you see that manifest across the board. The left is also culpable in that, in terms of what they're doing in the academy. There's something here at Portland State University that was amazing to me, and that was, excuse me, they had a um, a speaking event in which anybody could attend, but whites were not allowed to ask questions.
Hmm.
It blew my mind. I asked my buddy who's an appellate court judge. I said, I can't believe this is legal. He said, yeah, it's totally legal, but it's a horrible idea because then that would mean that they would have to have situations in which whites could present, blacks could attend, but blacks weren't allowed to ask any questions. So I see this. That's why I think the term regressive is good, because we're regressing to separate but equal. We're regressing to these points that hopefully we had overcome, but evidently not. I mean, I think it's an enormous problem, and at the root of the whole problem, I think that the thing that helps us to think about this is we need to think about these things in terms of this is a secular religion. They have all the hallmarks of a secular religion. They have blasphemy, they have speech political correctness, they have original sin, which is privilege, which is what we started this episode is off. So I think if we look at it in terms of that, we're really seeing the emergence of another religion.
That's the
When
end of our time
Christianity
today. We've been speaking with Dr. Peter Boghossian, full-time faculty member at Portland State University's Philosophy Department. The book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, has been the subject of some of our conversation today. Peter, always great to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we also have an app, Atheos, ATHEOS, app.com, that puts a lot of these principles into action for how to have effective conversations.